By early 1944, the Pacific War had reached a pivotal and brutal turning point. The attritional slugging matches in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea were winding down, and Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive was gaining ferocious momentum. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands had fallen. The next great objective, looming thousands of miles across the unforgiving ocean, was the Mariana Islands. To seize Saipan, Tinian, and Guam was to seize the airfields from which new B-29 superfortresses could finally strike the Japanese home islands. The strategic stakes were absolute. On paper, the matchup was a study in contrasts. The Imperial Japanese Navy, though bloodied, remained a formidable force built around a core doctrine, Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Their entire strategy relied on luring the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a single climactic engagement, where superior Japanese seamanship, night fighting skills, and the powerful Long Lance torpedo would annihilate the Americans. They believed the U.S. Navy's logistical tether, stretching 4,000 miles back to Pearl Harbor, was its fatal weakness. The Americans, conversely, were placing their faith in overwhelming industrial production and a rapidly growing technological edge. The problem was that a battleship built in a New York shipyard was useless if it couldn't be repaired, refueled, and rearmed at the tip of the spear. Distance was the true enemy. It was to defeat this enemy that an unwritten but ironclad operational order was set in motion. A directive not for a single battle, but for the creation of an entirely new kind of war machine. The plan was to build a floating, mobile naval base that could follow the fleet across the ocean. A secret weapon that was not a new gun or airplane, but a revolutionary concept of logistics. Its first great test came in the placid turquoise waters of a captured atoll named Majuro. The lagoon at Majuro was a city of gray steel shimmering in the February heat. Repair ships, tenders, and oilers of Service Squadron 10 lay at anchor amidst the warships of Admiral Mark Mitcher's legendary Task Force 58. From the deck of the repair ship, USS Vestal, the fleet looked invincible, but Chief Petty Officer Miles knew better. He leaned against the railing, the taste of salt and welding fumes in the air, and stared at the gaping wound in the starboard side of the battleship USS Indiana. She had collided with the USS Washington a week prior, a catastrophic accident that should have sent her limping back to Pearl Harbor for months of repair. Inside the floating dry dock where the Indiana now rested, the noise was a physical force, the deafening roar of acetylene torches slicing through torn steel, the rhythmic clang of hammers on rivet heads, and the constant hiss of pneumatic wrenches. Men, stripped to the waist and slick with sweat, swarmed over the battleship's hull. They were not in a state-of-the-art shipyard. They were performing complex structural surgery thousands of miles from the nearest friendly port, sustained by distilling ships that made fresh water and provision ships that delivered everything from beef to movie reels. Miles watched a new 40-ton plate, fabricated right here in the lagoon, being hoisted by crane to patch the wound. "She'll be ready for the Marianas, skipper. Don't you worry," a young lieutenant had told the battleship's captain just that morning. That scene, repeated across dozens of ships, was the physical manifestation of the new American doctrine. The repair of the Indiana at Majuro was more than a feat of engineering. It was a strategic statement. It announced that the U.S. Fifth Fleet no longer had a logistical leash. The Japanese strategy was anchored to static, fortified islands. The American strategy was now anchored to the fleet itself, a movable fortress of steel and supply. Japanese intelligence, operating on outdated assumptions, noted the reports of a crippled U.S. battleship. They calculated its absence from the American order of battle for the next 6 months, a fatal misreading of their enemy's new capability. They saw individual ships. They failed to see the system. That system, this vast unseen logistical foundation, was the secret order that would allow Task Force 58 to remain on station indefinitely, ready to strike, repair, and strike again. The stage was being set for a confrontation the Japanese could not imagine, because they could not conceive of the naval power that was now regenerating itself just over the horizon. The months following the Marshall's campaign became a brutal education for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their doctrine was predicated on the belief that after any major engagement, the American fleet would be forced to withdraw, bleeding and weakened, across thousands of miles of ocean to its fixed bases at Pearl Harbor or on the west coast. This operational pause would give Japan time to regroup, repair its own ships, and prepare for the next thrust. But the pause never came. The secret order, the commitment to forward-deployed, self-sustaining logistics, had created a phantom fleet. The ships the Japanese thought were retreating for repair were instead being patched, refueled, and rearmed just over the horizon. This invisible advantage transformed Task Force 58 from a raiding force into a persistent, grinding instrument of destruction. It did not need to retreat. It simply refilled its magazines, topped off its fuel tanks from a fleet of oilers at the fleet anchorage in Ulithi, and steamed back into battle. For the Japanese, it was like fighting a hydra. Reports would flood into truck of a damaged American carrier, only for reconnaissance planes to spot the same carrier launching a full strike wing 48 hours later. The relentless operational tempo was something they had never conceived of, and it began to fray their nerves and their war plans. Lieutenant Commander Rip Drake shoved his throttle forward, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney engine of his F-6F Hellcat screaming in protest. The flight deck of the USS Lexington was a vortex of controlled chaos. Men in colored jerseys sprinting across the non-skid deck, the hiss of the steam catapult, the acrid smell of aviation fuel. This was the fourth launch of the day, a fighter sweep over the Japanese bastion of Truk Atoll. For 2 straight days, from dawn until dusk, Task Force 58 had been pounding the fortress that was once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. As the catapult fired, Drake was slammed back into his seat, the world compressing into a blur of gray steel and blue water before his Hellcat clawed for altitude. Below him, the task force was a breathtaking sight. 15 carriers arranged in a ballet of mutual protection, their wakes churning the Pacific white. They had been at sea for weeks, yet they fought with the ferocity of a force fresh from port. "Every time we land," a young ensign had mumbled in the ready room, "the deck apes have the guns loaded and the tanks full before my engines even cooled." Drake circled, waiting for his division to form up. He was exhausted, his eyes gritty from salt water and lack of sleep, but looking down at the tireless machine below, he knew his enemy must be feeling something far worse: disbelief. That disbelief was curdling into strategic paralysis in Tokyo. At Imperial General Headquarters, intelligence officers stared at maps littered with contradictory pin flags. On April 22nd, Task Force 58 was spotted supporting General MacArthur's landings at Hollandia, New Guinea. Just over a week earlier, that same force had been reported over 1,200 miles away, hammering Palau. Their own pilots swore they had heavily damaged at least 3 American carriers in these engagements. Yet, here they were, operating with impunity. The Japanese Navy was built for the single decisive blow. The U.S. Navy, powered by its floating supply depots, was now built for the unending war of attrition. To the planners in Tokyo, the logistical mathematics didn't add up. They were forced to consider a terrifying possibility: that America's industrial might was even greater than they feared, and that they were not fighting one fleet, but 2 or 3. The truth was more devastating. They were fighting one fleet that had learned how to stay in the ring, round after round, without ever going back to its corner. This tireless fist was now closing on the Marianas, and the decisive battle the Japanese had always sought was about to be forced upon them on American terms. In June 1944, the war came to the Marianas. As U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan, the Imperial Japanese Navy saw its chance. This was the moment for which they had planned and trained for decades: Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, the most powerful carrier force Japan could still muster, sailed from its anchorage at Tawi-Tawi to annihilate the American invasion force. His plan was tactically brilliant, leveraging the superior range of his carrier aircraft to strike the U.S. fleet from a distance where they could not retaliate. He believed he was sailing against an exhausted, battle-worn American force, thinned out by months of continuous operations. He had no idea he was steaming toward a perfectly rested, fully supplied, and technologically superior buzzsaw. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, knew Ozawa was coming. Ultra intercepts had given him the enemy's intentions. His primary mission was to protect the Saipan landings, a duty he took with grim seriousness. While his aggressive carrier commander, Admiral Mitcher, strained at the leash to dash west and attack the Japanese carriers, Spruance held Task Force 58 back. He would let Ozawa come to him. He would fight the battle over his own ships, under the protective umbrella of his fleet's anti-aircraft guns and a massive combat air patrol guided by the newest miracle of war, shipboard radar. The Japanese were bringing tactics and warrior spirit. The Americans were bringing a system of industrialized warfare. Aboard his flagship, the brand new armored carrier, Taiho, Admiral Ozawa radiated a calm confidence. The reports laid before him confirmed his assumptions. American air groups, he was told, were depleted. Their pilots' green replacements for the veterans, lost in the grinding attrition of the past months. His own pilots, while less experienced than the heroes of Pearl Harbor, were eager, and their A6M0 fighters were still, he believed, the masters of the sky. His plan was sound. He would use the prevailing easterly winds to launch and recover his aircraft while extending the distance from the Americans. The first strike of over 70 planes was already airborne, winging its way toward the coordinates where American carriers were believed to be. Today, he remarked to his chief of staff, we will repay our debts from Midway. Lieutenant Alex Vraitsiu banked his F-6F Hellcat, scanning the brilliant blue emptiness of the Philippine Sea. The radio, once a crackle of static and routine check-ins, had gone electric. "Hey Rip, you seeing this?" his wingman called out. Vraitsiu looked down at his own radar scope. The screen was blooming with light, dozens of contacts, then hundreds. "Vector 250, the fighter director from the USS Lexington commanded, his voice unnervingly calm. "Bogies, Angels 20, looks like the whole damn Japanese Air Force." Vraitsiu and the other pilots of the great flying blue blanket turned to intercept. What they saw was a pilot's dream and a historian's turning point. The sky ahead was filled with Japanese aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters flying in neat textbook formations. They were flying directly into the teeth of over 450 American fighters, guided by perfect radar intelligence and firing guns whose shells were tipped with the deadly VT, or proximity, fuse, which allowed them to explode without a direct hit. It wasn't a dogfight, it was an execution. Vraitsiu lined up on a Yokosuka Judy dive bomber, squeezed the trigger, and watched the .50 caliber tracers stitch a line across its fuselage. The plane disintegrated in a flash of orange and black. He swung onto another, then another. The radio discipline broke into a cacophony of whoops and kill confirmations. It was, as one pilot famously radioed back to the fleet, like an old-fashioned turkey shoot. By the end of the day, Ozawa's meticulously planned strikes had been utterly annihilated. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot from the sky, with trivial losses for the Americans. The battle was a massacre, decided before the first Japanese pilot ever laid eyes on an American ship. The decisive battle had been fought, and it was a victory not of tactics, but of systems. The logistical chain that provided experienced pilots, superior aircraft, and revolutionary technology had paid its ultimate dividend. Ozawa's carriers, their air groups wiped out, were now little more than hollow targets. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation, but the carriers themselves, including Ozawa's flagship Taiho, sunk by the submarine USS Albacore, were still afloat and retreating. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon on June 20th, Admiral Mitcher made a fateful and agonizing decision. His scout planes had finally located the remnants of Ozawa's fleet. It was at the extreme edge of his aircraft's range, and launching a strike now meant his pilots would have to return in the dead of night, a maneuver of exceptional peril for which they were not trained. But the chance to sink the enemy carriers was too tempting. Against the advice of some of his staff, he ordered the launch. The consequences of that day's lopsided victory were now cemented by the desperate courage of the night recovery. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic and irrecoverable. They had lost 3 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft, the vast majority of their trained naval aviators. The mobile fleet would sail again at the Battle of Leyte Gulf a few months later, but as a hollow force, a carrier group with almost no planes, to be used as sacrificial bait. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine was dead. The Marianas were secured, and within months, the massive silver forms of B-29 superfortresses would be clawing their way into the stratosphere from airfields on Saipan and Tinian, beginning the final, fiery chapter of the war. Ensign Bill "Swede" Larson fought the controls of his SB-2C Helldiver, his eyes scanning the impenetrable blackness ahead. His fuel gauge was flirting with empty. His radio was a mess of panicked voices, and somewhere in the vast, dark ocean below was Task Force 58. The strike had been a success. They had found Ozawa's fleet and sunk the carrier Hayo. But now came the reckoning. Returning to a carrier in daylight was a controlled crash. At night, it was a blind prayer. Pilots, disoriented and out of fuel, began ditching their multi-million-dollar aircraft in the sea. The disciplined order of the fleet had dissolved into a desperate scramble for survival. Then, through the darkness, a miracle. A single star blossom burst ahead, then another. Pinpricks of light appeared on the horizon, growing into a brilliant constellation. Realizing the scale of the crisis, Admiral Mitcher had made another harrowing call, one that risked revealing his fleet to any lurking Japanese submarine. "Turn on the lights!" The fleet lit up like a city at sea. Carriers turned on their searchlights, pointing them straight up to serve as beacons. Destroyers fired star shells. Every ship in the task force turned on its running lights. For Larson, it was the most beautiful sight of his life. He found a carrier, didn't know or care which one, and brought his plane down in a jarring but safe landing. Men and machines were lost that night, but the fleet had saved its own. "That old man," a rescued pilot would say later, "he broke every rule in the book to bring his boys home." The unwritten order to prioritize logistics had now cast its long shadow over the rest of the war and the century to come. The principle was proven beyond all doubt. Battles are not won by the force that can inflict a single stunning blow, but by the force that can endure, regenerate, and relentlessly apply pressure. The floating bases of Majuro and Ulithi were more decisive than any single battleship. The ability to repair the USS Indiana in a forward area was ultimately more impactful than the torpedo that sank the Taiho. This logistical supremacy became the bedrock of American military doctrine. The Ghost Fleet was not one of phantom ships meant to deceive, but a very real fleet of oilers, tenders, and repair vessels, the unglamorous but essential foundation of global power projection. The legacy of Service Squadron 10 can be seen today in every carrier strike group that plies the world's oceans. A self-contained ecosystem of combat and support that can sustain itself indefinitely, thousands of miles from home. The Secret Order was never a single command, but a revolutionary philosophy, that the war would be won not at the point of the spear, but along the infinite length of its shaft.